It is the year 1487. Somewhere between the Alps and the Rhine River, in a village whose name time has erased, a 16-year-old girl named Margaret dresses in the clothes her mother chose for her. They are not clothes for dancing. They are clothes for being seen. In a few hours, she will be led to a room that is not hers. She will lie in a bed that is not hers, beside a man she has known for less than 3 weeks. And all of this will happen in front of witnesses, many witnesses. We, today, would call this a violation. They called it marriage. What we are about to examine is not an exception. It is not an excess, an isolated cruelty practiced by some sadistic feudal lord in a forgotten castle. What we are about to examine is an institution, a codified ritual, repeated for centuries across Christian Europe, from Scotland to Sicily, from Lisbon to Krakow. A ritual that answered to a coherent internal logic, to a worldview in which the idea that two people could marry in private, without anyone seeing, without anyone knowing, without anyone bearing witness, was not merely unusual. It was dangerous. It was, in many contexts, illegal. If this subject interests you and you are not yet part of this community, now is the moment to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Every week, a new window into the past that no one told you about in school. To understand the ritual of the public bed, we must first understand something our era has lost entirely. The medieval notion that the human body was not the property of the individual. It was the property of the family, of the church, of the state, of the Lord. And marriage was not the union of two affections. It was the formal transfer of a body from one lineage to another, a contract between clans, sealed in flesh. The logic began in canon law. The Catholic Church, which during the Middle Ages held near absolute jurisdiction over marriage in Western Europe, faced a problem that was at once practical and theological: how to prove that a marriage had truly taken place. In a time without civil registries, without photographic records, without bureaucratic documents accessible to most of the population, the word of two individuals was insufficient. Clandestine marriages, though celebrated in secret, without witnesses, without public announcement, were a legal nightmare that had haunted the Church since the earliest centuries of Christianity. The Fourth Lateran Council, held in 1215, attempted to resolve part of the problem by requiring that marriages be publicly announced on 3 consecutive Sundays before the ceremony, the so-called bans. The idea was simple. If anyone in the community knew of some impediment to the marriage, a forbidden kinship, a prior promise, a living spouse in another village, they would have time to come forward. Marriage was, in essence, a communal transaction that required communal approval. But the prior announcement resolved only half the problem. The other half was consummation. In medieval canon law, a marriage was not fully valid until it was consummated. The religious ceremony, the exchange of vows, the wedding banquet. All of this was necessary, but not sufficient. It was the physical act between the spouses that completed and sealed the matrimonial contract irrevocably. And if consummation needed to be proven, it needed to be witnessed. Illuminated manuscripts from the 13th century, today preserved in archives and libraries across Europe, describe with a precision that now seems bewildering the correct procedures for the consummation of a noble marriage. On these yellowed pages, we see stylized figures in a bed, and around them, other figures standing, watching. The medieval illustrator did not find it necessary to explain why they were there. For the original reader of that manuscript, the presence of witnesses was as obvious as the presence of the groom. In noble and royal families, the bedding ceremony was an elaborate and rigidly hierarchical ritual. The couple was escorted to the bridal chamber by a formal procession. The local bishop or priest blessed the bed, literally sprinkling holy water over the sheets and reciting prayers to drive away demons and ensure fertility. The ladies in waiting prepared the bride, The gentlemen prepared the groom. Each dressed the spouses in their sleeping garments, while the others watched with the solemnity of those witnessing a sacrament, because, in a sense, that is exactly what it was. The couple then lay down, and the witnesses remained. How long did they stay? This varied according to the era, the region, and the social stratum. In some documented traditions, the witnesses withdrew after seeing the two together beneath the sheets, which was considered sufficient evidence that consummation would occur. In others, especially in royal marriages where dynastic rights depended on indisputable legitimate heirs, the witnesses remained in the room through the entire night, positioned so as not to see the bed directly, but present enough to attest under oath that the couple had slept together. Here is a good moment to pause. If you have not yet done so, leave a like on this video. It seems like a small gesture, but it is what tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to be seen. And a question for the comments. Where are you watching this video from? City, country? Let us know. It is always surprising to discover how far these stories travel. There are documented cases that went even further. Louis XIV, the Sun King, slept technically in public, surrounded by courtiers who held the privilege and the duty to be present at his waking and his retiring. The lever ceremony, the king's morning preparation ritual before his court, was not an optional spectacle. It was protocol, and the royal wedding night was merely the most formal moment of an existence lived entirely under the gaze of others. But it would be a mistake to think this ritual was exclusive to the aristocracy. In 1344, in an ecclesiastical court in York, England, a man named Thomas de Burgh attempted to annul his marriage on the grounds that it had never been consummated. His wife, Agnes, brought 4 witnesses who stated they had been present on the wedding night and could attest to the contrary. The court considered the testimony valid. The marriage was upheld. The privacy of Thomas and Agnes on that night years before had been the legal guarantee of the indissolubility of their bond. This case was not unusual. Medieval ecclesiastical archives are filled with similar proceedings. Matrimonial contracts from the 15th century, preserved in archives throughout Italy, included specific clauses stipulating that respected matrons of the community be present in the bridal chamber to attest to the consummation. If the bride were returned to her family of origin on grounds of non-consummation, the groom's family would forfeit half the dowry already paid. The witnesses were the guarantee for both parties. The role of women in this ritual deserves special attention because it is frequently misunderstood. The witnesses in the bridal chamber were not voyeurs or instruments of humiliation, or at least they were not perceived as such by the era. They were in large measure protectors. The presence of respected matrons also served to ensure that the bride could not be mistreated without witnesses, that the groom could not falsely claim non-consummation to annul the marriage and escape with the dowry, that the bride's family had representatives there to attest to their daughter's honor. In a world without individual legal protections, collective surveillance was, paradoxically, a form of protection. The absence of privacy also served as a shield. This does not mean the ritual was experienced without anguish. Etiquette manuals from the 15th century devote entire pages to instructions on how witnesses should conduct themselves in the bridal chamber. They must keep their eyes averted from the bed. They must speak quietly among themselves. They must demonstrate respect for the solemnity of the moment. The very fact that such instructions were necessary suggests they were not always followed, and that there existed, even in that context, an awareness that something delicate was taking place, and that it deserves some form of deference. The tension between the public duty to bear witness and respect for some form of personal decency is visible in these texts. It is not the tension of people who have discovered privacy. It is the tension of people who have not yet invented it, but already felt something that approached its necessity. To understand why this system endured so long, one must also understand the architecture of medieval daily life. The typical pre-modern European house had no corridors. Each room led to the next, without transitional spaces. Parents, children, servants, guests, and domestic animals shared the same spaces, slept in the same halls, witnessed the same bodily functions. The human body was a constant public presence not through cultural perversion, but through structural necessity. There was no architecture for privacy because there was not yet the idea that it was necessary. In this context, the ritual of the public bed was not an intrusion upon intimacy. It was simply one more moment in a life lived entirely in community. The Great Transformation begins slowly in the 16th century and has two principal engines that operate in partially opposite directions, yet converge upon the same result. The first engine is the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, by rejecting marriage as a sacrament and transferring it to civil jurisdiction, inadvertently opened space for new forms of regulation. The Protestant states of Northern Europe began creating civil marriage registries, written documents that partially replaced the need for physical witnesses. If the state recorded the marriage on paper, with the signature of a civil authority, the presence of witnesses in the bridal chamber became less essential as legal evidence. The second engine is, paradoxically, the Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563. The Catholic response to the Reformation. Among its many determinations, Trent required that marriages be celebrated publicly, before a priest and at least two witnesses, and that they be recorded in parish registers. This requirement of written record, while maintaining the need for witnesses at the religious ceremony, reduced the pressure on the bridal chamber as a site of proof. The proof now existed on paper, archived in the sacristy. Neither process immediately eliminated the ritual. Cultural practices have an inertia that legal institutions take decades or centuries to overcome. But the juridical foundation that made the presence of witnesses in the bridal chamber a formal necessity was gradually removed. At the same time, something deeper was changing in European culture. The historian Norbert Elias documented, in his monumental study of the transformation of European manners and customs between the 13th and 18th centuries, a gradual shift in what people considered shameful, intimate, improper for external eyes. Bodily functions that had once been performed openly were progressively surrounded by restrictions, moved to private spaces, covered in social silence. Sexuality followed the same path, but more slowly, given its importance for the transmission of property and the definition of lineage. By the 17th century, references to witnesses in the bridal chamber begin to disappear from etiquette manuals and legal treatises. When they do appear, it is frequently to regulate their absence, to establish that if the couple prefers privacy, this is now acceptable, provided other formal requirements have been met. Privacy was being invented, one exception at a time. The process was neither linear nor universal. In rural regions of Europe, variants of the nuptial witnessing ritual survived into the 19th century, and in some documented cases, into the early 20th. In the most isolated regions of the Balkans, the Apennines, and the Mediterranean islands, the presence of matrons in the bridal chamber to attest to the bride's virginity persisted as social custom even after losing legal relevance. Ethnographic records collected in Sardinia in the 1920s describe this custom in mountain villages with a disconcerting normality. It was simply what one did, what had always been done, what mothers had gone through at their own weddings, and saw no reason to question. Privacy as a right had not yet reached those mountains. It arrived eventually, carried by public schooling, by compulsory military service, by the radio, by the modern state, and by everything else the 20th century poured over the last strongholds of traditional Europe. And when it arrived with the force of a revelation, a new way of understanding the body, marriage, and individual identity that made the world that had preceded it, retrospectively, inconceivable. We return to the young Margaret, whom we imagined at the beginning of this story. She lived her entire life without the mental category that allows us to perceive her situation as a violation. She had no words for what she felt, if she felt anything beyond nervousness and resignation. The same things her mother had felt, and her mother's mother before her. The concept that was missing was not courage, nor awareness. It was privacy, an idea that did not yet exist. When exactly did intimacy become a right? When did the wedding bed become definitively a space that the gaze of others has no permission to reach? Is there a date, a law, a treaty we can point to? Or did privacy settle in silently, like nightfall, with no one noticing exactly the moment the light disappeared, and the darkness, at last, became our own? If this video made you think, share it with someone who appreciates history told with depth. Subscribe to the channel if you're not yet part of this community, and leave a like. It helps more people find content like this. Every view, every comment, every share is what makes it possible to keep telling stories that time nearly forgot. This documentary is based on historical research, primary and secondary documentary sources, medieval canon law treatises, ecclesiastical records, and academic works by historians including Philippe Ariès, Norbert Elias, and Georges Duby. Images and videos generated by artificial intelligence were used to illustrate and dramatize historical events. Secondary character names are fictional and created for narrative purposes. Historical figures and events mentioned are based on verifiable records.